and Lale will introduce this one. And just a quick thing, we do have a couple questions in the chat, two really great questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them at some point. In any case, they'll help us think through some of these important questions. So Lale, if you want to begin.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, the speakers on the second panel will include Etienne Balibar, Oscar Valle, Robyn Marasco, and Despina Paraskeva. Etienne, you are the first speaker. Please start if you're ready to.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lala. Okay, first of all, I want to thank you all. Thank Joseph for setting up this wonderful meeting. Can you hear me, or should I speak louder? No, is it okay? Yes.
Yeah, everything is okay. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I must say that I find it extremely moving to be there with all of you, very old friends, Warren, of course, the first of all, and more recent ones, and future friends, perhaps. That's a marvelous opportunity. Now, this being said, I will offer now some apologies for what is coming, and I ask for your understanding and perhaps forgiveness. First of all, and I'm not happy with that, I can't stay until the end of the conference, of the symposium. Not just because there is a time difference between Paris and LA or Berkeley. You might say you could for once stay awake a little longer than usual. But the fact is that I need to catch a train very early tomorrow morning for another place, and well, I'm not sure I can make it to the end. And second, and worst of all, I don't have a paper. Meaning not only I don't have a written paper, which perhaps in a sense could be a good thing, but I don't have a paper because I had thought initially that I would reflect around this formula, which I will explain, the blind spot in Althusser's ideology. I had something like a question in mind or an intuition, perhaps. But of course, in order to be able to make good of that, I should work. I should return to the text. I should elaborate. And this is exactly what I couldn't do in the last period. First of all, because I was sick for a month. It wasn't COVID, but it was not really good either. And second, I hope you don't find this inappropriate, but I was completely caught in, obsessed by the situation in Palestine and trying to set up interventions, etc., with France and reading things, etc. So I never found the time to. Okay, so in that situation, perhaps a good choice would have been to just cancel my participation. That would have been the serious thing to do. But I immediately thought that I didn't have the capacity, the desire, the will to be away from the meeting. So here I am with nothing to say, but nevertheless I will propose a few ideas just for something like conversation. Now allow me to immediately indicate what this issue of the blind spot is about, and you'll find it pretty vulgar in a sense. It's a very brutal way of introducing a problem. But the fact is that for many years now, and I'm not the only one, of course, in that situation, part of my attention and my theoretical ruminations, I would say, combined with, as for many of us, I mean, various forms of activism, I would say, in political or social movements, was about a big issue called race and racism. And at some point, because, of course, I had been trained as an Althusserian, everybody knows that, and inevitably, as a consequence, I find myself probably until the end in the situation that our friend Emilio de Ipola has described and wonderfully, I believe, expressed in the title of his book. I believe that there are many interesting books about Althusser, and many of you have contributed to that. But there are two for me which, in a sense, stand out, and these are Warren's book and Emilio de Ipola's book, called in Spanish El Infinito Adiós. The farewell that never ends, and I'm exactly in that situation. So again and again, of course, when facing a question like an issue like what kind of ideology is that, racism, or what kind of ideological category, one foot in abstraction and another one in daily, I would say, and permanent political practice is race. I realized that I had no use of Althusser. But then at some point I went a little further than that. There were several elements that pushed me in that direction, and I'll come back to that indirectly. Namely, I came to the idea, or to the surprise, I would say, and in a sense the embarrassment that the question of race and racism is something like an absolute blind spot in Althusser's reflections on politics theory, and especially the question of ideology. Of course, you might want to say that if you propose a list, kind of enumeration of names which one way or another refer to the orientations, I would say the tendencies of what we as Marxists, and Althusser is a Marxist, keep calling, or tend to call, the dominant ideology, there will be no difficulty to place or to locate, to put race and racism in the enumeration. But I tended to ask for something more. And the only thing I found, in a sense, is a short sentence, but there's no race there. In Althusser's famous essay on ideological state apparatuses, where he indicates in passing that the ideological state apparatuses then will continuously work, imposing and inculcating on the minds and the behavior of the individual such ideologies as, he says, nationalism, moralism, and economicism. So perhaps behind nationalism there is also racism hiding somewhere, but the name is not there. And then I said to myself, this is quite amazing in a sense, and this is part of something I inherited from him, which is something like a political education. A man like Althusser, born in Algiers, in the capital of the most important French colony, becoming a member of the Communist Party shortly after the war, and being witness during his life of all the great colonial wars, Indochina first, and Vietnam and Algeria, excuse me, and Algeria then. And here again, incidentally, when I, with my generation, Rancière, Badiou, Duroux, others, etc., became Althusser students, we were at the same time directly involved as we could, of course, as young students in the protest against the colonial war. So in a sense, for us, this was part of the same commitment in politics, etc. Except I have to say, apparently, of course, we might talk, go to the same demonstrations in a sense, but in his theory, there's no place for that. So now that is not sufficient. I have to accelerate to make a problem. If you ask yourself, if you find that surprising, and you start, which perhaps it is not, and you start asking yourself, what are the reasons for that? So some reasons are apparently external, and others seem to be more in the descriptive sense, intrinsic, I would say, or immanent to a theory, but they're not separated from one another. Natalia was quoting a moment ago, and my ear immediately listened to that, a sentence that she found somewhere in Althusser. I'm no longer sure where it is, perhaps in the three notes, but I'm not totally, where he writes, apparently joining or anticipating considerations which are today quite active after the publication of Donna Haraway's famous paper on situated knowledge, in which she quotes Althusser. That's very interesting. That you cannot see everything from any place. So in order to see, in the intellectual sense of the term, certain facts or certain problems rather than facts, you need to be located somewhere and not in another place. So from there, we might, of course, want to ask the question, suppose, I'm completely aware of the fact that I'm pulling the thread very strongly in an extremely problematic direction. I seem to be setting up a kind of posthumous trial for Althusser. So which place would he be located from which the question of racism, and behind the question of racism, the question of colonialism, which is not all of racism, but it's certainly something crucial to understand, it would not be visible or would not be relevant. And the quick answer is, of course, the French Communist Party. So that would be a long discussion, but we all remember. So, of course, we would very much like Althusser to be not completely aligned on the blindness that famously Aimé Césaire denounced in his letter to Maurice Thorez, but perhaps that's part of the explanation. And if we went into that direction, we would perhaps that's a dangerous path, because asking this kind of question leads to asking similar questions about other, I would say, problems, categories, examples of ideological formations, I would say, which play no role in Althusser's examination. I'm particularly thinking of socialism, but I leave that when he went to it in the end, in the aleatory, the very last, etc., etc. So I could elaborate on that, but I will leave it aside because I believe that the time is running, and I believe that the theoretical issues are more important. So another quick remark in passing. Suppose you imagine you try and think that you could bring in the question of racism into an Althusserian problematic of the ideological state apparatuses, which it remains, like it or not, and I completely agree with that, it's full of difficulties. We heard about that, Stefano, etc. But and Warren himself. But the immediate remark that comes to mind would be all the ideological formations. And perhaps we can bring back the category of discourse, the discourses that he describes as essential, I would say, structural components of the general process of ideological reproduction of the dominant ideology are linked to specific apparatuses. We know that, and we all have our problems with that. The trade unions, the family, the school, the church, the legal apparatuses. What kind of ideological state apparatus would you associate with the discourse on race and racism? Perhaps they exist, but in order to take them into account, you probably have to break with what remains undoubtedly the functionalist aspect and dimension of Althusser's reflection on reproduction, which is completely dependent on a certain centrality, I would say, and as you know, I myself contributed to that as of the idea of the mode of production, and brushes aside or leaves no room for such historical, not to say historicist, issues as colonialism, imperialism, etc., etc. Okay. But that perhaps is, and I will, but finally, if you give me a few, another 2 or 3 minutes, this is not what created the most interesting problem in my mind. I went to the paradoxical idea that perhaps there exists a kind of invisible or latent, if you prefer, articulation in Althusser's reflection on ideology between something that is absent, I would say the issue of racism, and something that remains until the end through various elaborations and re-elaborations, a complete aporia, namely the question of the articulation of the two objects. He's very insistent on the term object, and I tend to believe that this is part of the problem. Freud's object, the unconscious, and Marx's object, or the object that, as a Marxist, we want to attribute to Marx, that is ideology. That is ideal. So I came to the idea, not any serious, and I've been taught by some of my masters, Canguilhem in particular, that there's something completely paradoxical in trying to construct a theoretical discourse to articulate voids, if you like. I mean, something that is not there, the discourse on racism, but that you interpret as a symptomatic failure or avoidance and blah, blah. And something that is clearly an aporia, that is namely, how do we understand this articulation? And I'll finish with that for the following reason. First, and I don't elaborate on that, I increasingly tend to believe that the issue of racism is not to be addressed seriously today or in the past if you don't combine intellectual or conceptual tools or instruments that come from historical materialism, if you don't see racism as an ideology, and from psychoanalysis that have to do with what has been called here phantasm, probably also the death drive, as enigmatic as it remains. And I may add something that I'll close. 2 elements that pushed me in that direction. The first was the fact that some time ago, returning for the reasons you know to again and again to the propositions in the essay on ideological state apparatuses and its final enigma that Warren beautifully, I believe, describes and interprets in his text to look for answers in Foucault and et cetera, I discovered that among the notes that had been left by Althusser that are in his archive, there is a notebook where he, exactly contemporary with the elaboration of that text, where he rereads Freud's mass psychology and the analysis of the ego, mass psychology, etc., and as Marx himself did, and so many others, excerpts from the text. I mean, copies entire passages, which leads, of course, to the intuition, I would say, and the problematic intuition that there exists a very strong analogy, in a sense, between what Freud describes in that essay, which I would summarize as the eternal circle of identifications from which you never escape. You can change your identifications, of course. You can move from God to the revolution. Perhaps they're not exactly the same. I would never say that. But the process of identification is the same in Freudian terms. And of course, Althusser's huge problem in the essay, which so many readers have identified, namely the fact that you have to locate even revolutionary practice within the field of ideological interpellations. And then the second element, and excuse me, I really stopped, came from the fact that my friend Pierre Macheret, a good friend of all of us, in a relatively recent essay that many of you, I believe, have read. I believe it's been translated into English, published somewhere, but it's now a chapter of the remarkable, the extraordinary book called Le Sujet des Normes, has proposed a parallel, a confrontation between two descriptions, scenes of interpellation. Althusser's ideological interpellation in the article, and Fanon's famous description in Black Skin, White Mask. So I don't elaborate because we all know that. So Pierre, in a sense, had the and Pierre Macheret beautifully shows that they are antithetic in many respects. But that address, in a sense, the same structure, or two varieties on the same structure. And in order to interpret that, you need to move to a Foucauldian point of view, which in a sense is pretty much the same trajectory, I would say, as the one that Warren has proposed in his chapter. Now, Warren's chapter in Althusser and his contemporary is a very strange chapter when you reread it, because it's called Lacan and Althusser and his contemporaries. So Althusser and X, Y, etc. Althusser and Lacan, and then the genealogy of the notion of interpellation. There's barely a discussion of Lacan in that chapter. So Lacan is a kind of hidden, latent horizon. Of course, he's mentioned. I don't say he's not mentioned at all. But the core issue that so many others wanted to discuss, namely the extremely strange parallelism, almost the identical formulations that Althusser uses to describe the relationship between the subject small s and the subject big S, and the way in which Lacan describes the domination of subjective desire by the discourse of the other and the desire of the other. This is not touched by Warren. I don't reproach you for that. Huh? The compensation for that is the extraordinary thing that you find at the end. I admire that enormously when you say, in fact, this is a force problem. Stefano repeated what you have written about contradictions in Althusser. The fact that Althusser continuously returns to dualisms that he wanted to eliminate. As if Althusser could not get rid of the question of the pineal gland, and that's and then you say when you say, but we can propose a Spinozistic solution for that, provided we interpret ideology on one side and unconscious on the other side as two Spinozistic attributes, which propose expressions or orders of causality for one and the same substance, which joins in a sense, and perhaps it was suggested by that, this incredibly very strange thing at the core of the essay on ideological state apparatuses, when Althusser in 5 lines manages to explain that ideology and the unconscious are one and the same problem, and nevertheless remain completely antithetic ideas. And what is it that makes them similar? He says they have the same relationship to the issue of eternity. So whether eternity means the same when you are thinking of repetition on the side of the unconscious, or you are thinking of a structural invariant on the side of class societies, that's a complete enigma, and nobody will ever resolve that. Eternity is the word which takes them together. So I never went very far in the discussion of my own problem, but I ask your forgiveness for taking too much of your time. And I swear I will not leave that if I'm still alive before I can say something more serious.
Thank you, Etienne. I wish, and I'm sure this is a shared feeling, that we had more time for you to elaborate on it. It was very, very interesting. Thank you. And the next speaker is Oscar.
Yeah. Hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, Oscar, we can hear you.
Cool, thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of the event and for allowing us to treat such an influential book like Montag's. I also would like to briefly mention that this work that I am about to present has been gathered from the work I have begun recently with my dissertation, and that many of this is still trying to kind of ground itself around problems that have surged from the Baroque period and the influence it had on the avant-garde group called the Contemporaries in Mexico, or as they were called, a group without a group. As I have progressed within this context of the Baroque, I have found Althusser and the materialism of the encounter very fruitful, and I have even wondered how and if Althusser was thinking about some of the problems that the Baroque poses, especially when things turn to problems of history, the construction of history, and allegory. I have run into a problem that has to do with identifying a misencounter that took place, or maybe did not, around the 1930s in Mexico between this avant-garde group and the trip Antonin Artaud took to Mexico to give 3 conferences and to do his research on pre-Hispanic cultures to find its influence on contemporary Mexico, and also to find other means to bring back to France, other cultural means, revolutionary means to bring back to France. I began by noticing the similarities between the written works of one of the members of the Contemporaries and the main figure of interest for me, Jorge Cuesta and Antonin Artaud. What struck me was the relation to the political conjuncture of that time and the revolutionary solutions that they thought more important. Both agreed that Marxism and communism were missing something, and that it lacked a true understanding of the revolutionary potential that could derive from a true or more real culture. As much as I find their similarities interesting, it does not in itself suffice to make it or to count as an encounter. It has to do with a working backwards, as Althusser writes in The Underground Current of the Materialism of the Encounter, when listing the principles of the encounter, or of encounter, that no determination of the being, I quote here, which issues from the taking hold of the encounter is prefigured, even in outline, in the being of the elements that converge in the encounter. Quite the contrary, no determination of these elements can be assigned except by the working backwards from the result to its becoming, in its retroaction. If at the moment, so I end quote there, if at the moment of the visit by Artaud, nothing really transpired between the Mexican avant-garde and Artaud, it does not mean that it was a misencounter that should be left behind. As one of the contemporaries of the Contemporaneos, Luis Cardoso y Aragon, recounted in a later autobiography of his, I quote here, he's here talking about Artaud's visit. How can I forget Antonin Artaud? He brought some money, very little. He was already asking for help in letters he wrote on board and put in mail in Havana. The National Autonomous University of Mexico sponsored 3 conferences for him. In all 3, he went beyond the texts we know. He gave them on February 26, 27, 29 of 1936 at the Bolivar Amphitheater of the National Preparatory School. How to sponsor such a devil? In the second conference of the 30 listeners of the first, there were 8. So pretty much he just mentions how the first conference there were a bunch of people, and the second and third it went down to 5 and then 3. He says, it was the most brilliant conference. Neither Villarrutia nor Lasso, which are members of the Contemporaneos, treated Artaud. I have already said it, but I repeat it. It still surprises me. Did that voyeur scare them? For them, unpresentable even in the cafe or in the brewery next door where he ate. Did Artaud even eat? The point here is pretty much that the Contemporaneos, even if they were in attendance of his conferences, they did nothing with his work, pretty much. Cuesta wasn't there, by the way. If there is an encounter between Artaud and Cuesta Sta, it is a product as a series of series of causes. Their treatment of Marxism in 1930s as their opponent for their own projects, for me, puts them at play in the contradictions that Althusser already makes visible, and the ones that Montag writes about in the intro to Althusser and his contemporaries. I quote, in fact, Althusser repeatedly argued that the most effective attacks on Marxism came from within rather than from without, based not on the importation into Marxism of foreign theories such as functionalism or rational choice theory, but on citations from Marx, Engels, and Lenin. If this were true, then the most effective defenses of Marxism might require a detour outside of it to apparently foreign and even apparently anti-Marxist philosophies, whose concepts might play an indispensable role in neutralizing these attacks and even in making Marxist thought intelligible. I say the very attacks against the Marx of that time bring to light the Marx of the underground current than it does a Marx for all time. So that's my argument here. Artaud has this to say in his second essay, presented titled Man Against Destiny. So this is one of Artaud's sort of complaints or sort of critiques against Karl Marx. History that records facts is a simulacrum of dead reason. Karl Marx has fought against the simulacrum of facts. He has tried to feel the thought of history in its particular dynamism. but he has stopped, he too, on a fact. So he stopped on one fact, or a few facts. He lists a few: the capitalist, the bourgeois fact, and machines, and so on and so forth. Quest, on the other hand, Questa's title itself is long enough to show his own attack against Marx. This is the title of his work. Marx was not intelligent, not scientific, not revolutionary, neither a socialist, but rather a counter-revolutionary and mystic. I quote something from this work, from Questa's work. They say that extremes touch, but in this case, it is not possible to see how a real socialism is derived from Marx's doctrine without denying it in its entirety. Ideas are defined by their opposites, indeed, and by reaction, the revolution is defined. It is possible that in this dialectical form, Marx's doctrine can define socialism. This is also the way in which it is possible for it to define science, and how it can be the cause of revolutionary and intellectual activity. For in the last analysis, Marx is reaction. His genius and his greatness are the genius and greatness of reaction. End quote. My question is how to think about the encounter between both through Althusser's Marx. Sorry, between Questa and Althusser. Questa and Artaud in reading Althusser. This leads me to chapter 8 of Montag's book on the theoretical scene, trying to treat this as a theoretical scene, or our theoretical theater, which speaks of an allegorical figure that is a consequence of an unrepresentability. In what I'm presenting here is more of the unrepresentability of the sort of materiality of history in a sort of sense. This I relate to the encounter or the misencounter. So in order to kind of get into that, I'm gonna give context a bit of the Contemporaries, and hopefully I could address some of these things. So what did it mean that the Contemporaries were a group without a group? I kind of think about them as they each go their own way in a sort of disseminated fashion. We must keep in mind that their disjunction and misplacement with their time. I like to emphasize and play with the idea of something like a parameter. This notion that gives the sense of going alongside, but also is a measure, a stance and a position within the conjuncture itself. However, and in which way each member came to understand it is like a present alongside a present, each one incomplete and perhaps susceptible to disintegration, or no hold at all as to its possible constitutive state, whatever the case may be, or rather may have been. A parameter is like an imagined state of affairs, and it's thinking through and around it. If you like, as an example, an allegory is a mode of expression that preserves the parameters of identifiable repetitions, empirical things, if you like, and then says one thing but means another, to put it perhaps too briskly to justify it completely. I only intend to sustain this idea of a setting up and retaining some fragments of a general repetition. And in this case, it is not so much that an allegorical process of history occurs in the incompleteness of the perspicacity of these writers of the 1930s in Mexico, but just that in its own material expression as something that occurred and that a text exists. What remains from what they deemed as present is the figurative lines and their encounters, i.e. parameters. I also believe that in their works, they each in their own way thought about these problems of temporality, form, and causality. So as much as I'm depending on this notion of parameter, at least today, I'd like to make a note that it is preliminarily derived from the Baroque period, which interested them in their counterpositions against nationalism. None of them, at least, excuse me, at least from what I have read of them up to now, have used this notion. However, from reading Jorge Cuesta, we get a sense that revolution was to be continued after the setting up of educational economics institutions, or the sort of state, the institution or the constitution of the state, of the Mexican state. So he was kind of pushing for the Mexican, so more of the cultural side, cultural production side for revolution. In order to do so, he engaged with European forms that pretty much went back to, 17th century writer like Sor Juana, in the act to return to the poetic forms of Sor Juana and to the philosophical problems that she made visible in her poetry. The Contemporaries republished and edited her works and brought her to the center stage of cultural production at a time when a lot of literary works were recounting the revolution of the decade before. And also writing out, so this period was filled with literature about the revolution, pretty much, Mexican Revolution. To say the least, this nationalistic project was what Cuesta called a romantic aspiration in the worst sense. Pretty much, he threw in there a lot of Mexican philosophers like Jose Vasconcelos, I think Reyes, and pretty much the parameters here, or the materiality of the form of that present that Cuesta is drawing out, for example, leaves open, at least in the critical age, more criticism, and in the academic and philosophical tradition, more possible interpretations to be written out. What I'm trying to draw attention are not those basic recognitions. I like to rather focus on what is being said here without being said, that the concepts towards which the state is building upon are those of philosophy, and the way they are being employed are not in accordance with the conjuncture. Thus, Cuesta and the contemporaneos are writing out this problem of the theoretical conjuncture while writing out the historical one. But in what way can we say that they intend this or even achieve this? They take all kinds of forms of writing that produce poetry, literary criticism, philosophy, and even paint. Some of them were more Kantians, the other more Hegelian, another more preoccupied with pre-Hispanic thought. Was what made them contemporaries something they agreed on, or things they disagreed on? At another time, I like to argue more extensively that they all follow a tendency, but they, as contemporaries to each other, also enter into a combat by experimentation. The tendency extends to the opposition against their time, but they also know that they are already in the modern without the striving to put into effect a modernism. One could capture this from Jorge Cuesta's critiques, but most importantly, Jorge Cuesta was the most direct and most hated for directly attacking all the scenes you can think of, social scenes you could think of. To make all of this clear, why talk about parameters? Why the emphasis on contemporaneous stance against their contemporaries? Why even a combat against themselves? The problem has emerged out of thinking about the contemporaneos, but in this particular work, in thinking about Jorge Cuesta's work that was only recently collected along with unpublished articles, puts the question how to come to think about the effects of his work without over-historicizing his context. I find it debilitating to the effects of the contradictions that he unfolds in Mexico. And Mexico as seen as an individual, or perhaps as a body, to constrict the figure of Cuesta alongside the effects he expressed, or put into discursive play when we say this writer, critic, and poet, active in Mexico in 1920s, 1930s, or even as a madman or curse poet. There are effects of cultural production that perhaps do not hold as long as others. There are some that go unnoticed or become irrelevant. The problem becomes how can those, in this case, textual effects contain their line of force without containing a telos in a reading of them, as if they were full of intention in themselves. As if we attribute a simple pass to an author in his work, determined by an idea of historical progress. I do not deny the concept of limits, and if it is aligned with parameters, less so. A political economic limit could very well be enforced and exist and hold on for many years, perhaps even centuries. But alongside it, a different temporality can be put into effect by replicating it by a sort of reading. My example of the allegorical expression for what constitutes the limits and what constitutes the effects of the limits. Excuse me. And lastly, this problem was not something unknown to Cuesta. If Diego Rivera, the famous muralist painter at the time that was appointed by Jose Vasconcelos, the Mexican philosopher at the time, to paint all the murals and stuff like that, pretty much that group, Rivera, Vasconcelos, and the Ateños, sought Mexican identity outside the language, outside the history of Hispanic literature. Then they would not truly engage with universal problems as much as they believed they were. Cuesta once wrote this about, is an example already talked about, which is pretty much he related them to a romanticism, given that they were so far out from the reality of things, according to Cuesta. So I have two little last paragraphs here to finish up something that is still in the works, of course. What becomes clear then is the way in which the mythologies produced by Rivera and Vasconcelos are those determined by a teleological view of history, and also as the organization of representation by historicism. From Vasconcelos, the idealistic view that Mexico would eventually produce the cosmic race through the mixture of races. This race would become sort of a new human by the acquisition of picking out the best spiritual aspects of the different cultures and races. And Rivera, on the other hand, the eventual, pretty much his view is the eventual communist state as the traditional allegorical forms represented, which he painted pretty much, represented the indigenous races of Mexico as part of the progress of Mexican history. This movement was called indigenismo. If it's not already obvious, I too notice this two sort of separate forms of allegory. One that is not historical or is not heavy on historicism, and this other one that's sort of more aleatory. So to finish up, what do we gain from what Montag makes visible through Althusser? That as a philosophy for Marx would show the aleatory materialism that comes to disrupt the fixed image of a Mexican state. The Marx and Althusser that he himself distanced from when he was part of the Communist Party, and those views to which his contemporaries were marked by, disrupts also a past. This past that I have drawn out as Mexico in the 1930s is only emphasized as a period containing a misencounter that has a retroactive reading through the notion, that is a retroactive reading through the notion of structure. It puts into question the misencounter not as a lost chance, but the visibility of a chance not taken. Only in the distance taken do the effects take the shape, almost like two atoms moving in the void, one atom from the outside and one from the inside of this moment in Mexico where there is a void. These two are not necessarily Artaud and Cuesta, but the translation of each by each when they encounter each other. But since they never did, they do so by translation. By an unfolding does the encounter occur, then a translation, then a real engagement with the Kampfplatz or the battlefield does this thinking take. And that's the end.
Thank you, Oscar. That was great.
Thank you.
Robyn is the next speaker.
Thank you. And I assume everybody can hear me. And so I'll just get
Yes.
started. First, I just want to thank the organizers, Lale, Joseph, and Dylan, for including me in this day's event. It's an absolute honor to discuss Warren's book, the inaugural moment, as far as I'm concerned, in the rediscovery of Althusser that is still taking place and has been sustained by the intellectual community that Warren has built over his extraordinary career. I also want to thank the truly incomparable Etienne Balibar for beginning with a mention of the war in Palestine and for speaking to the question of racism today. The question of Palestine and the question of racism today, which are, of course, deeply linked in our present and linked in connection with the long and tragic history of the Jewish question in Europe. I must also just thank Warren for this little corner of the academy that you have carved out that reaches across the Americas and across oceans, a community that is truly multilingual and international and multidisciplinary. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. I could say more here about why Warren is absolutely the example I strive to imitate, both in his style of being a professional academic, a wholly unpretentious and anti-elitist style, vanishingly rare in the academy today, and in his body of scholarship, which is as rigorous as it is wide-ranging. If only I could write books half as good as the books Warren writes. This brings me to Althusser and his contemporaries, the book that gathers us here today, the book that 10 years ago reset the terms of the reception and debate about Althusser's philosophy. This book showed that Spinoza was a key source for Althusser's philosophy. It recast Althusser's relationship to structuralism, a term that tends to obscure the important differences between the structuralist psychoanalysis of Jacques Lacan and the structuralist anthropology of Levi-Strauss, as well as to the allegedly post-structuralist paradigm that includes Derrida and Foucault. Montag places Althusser within a theoretical conjuncture that includes all of these names, in which Althusser escapes the confines, so-called structuralist Marxism, and the bitter conflicts of 1968 to enter the 21st century anew as an analyst of the philosophical conflicts in which he was also a participant. I hope to return to this figure of Althusser, the analyst and participant, or better, the analyst who grants himself the powers of self-analysis, toward the end of my talk. In the time that remains, I want to focus on three key insights that I draw from Warren's extraordinary book. First, the idea of the conjuncture, or the political and philosophical conflicts in which Althusser's thought is situated. Second, a certain way of reading Althusser according to his own protocols and in terms of these constitutive conflicts. And finally, the absolutely essential idea of the state apparatus. One of the many things I love about Warren's book is that it refuses to dispense with Althusser's much misunderstood concept of ideology and reminds us that this concept is attached to other essential but often forgotten or neglected concepts, namely the concept of the state and the concept of apparatus. I would argue that this gloss on ideology, in which the subject of ideology is always a question of the state and state apparatuses, places Althusser on the terrain where he, in fact, spent much of his intellectual career, from his early writings on Hegel and Montesquieu to his later reflections on Machiavelli, namely the terrain of political theory. I confess that I am not a philosopher, but a trained political theorist, which is to say that I'm housed in a department and trained in a discipline that claims for itself the name of science. And what I do in that house with that training is something called theory, a practice that moves somewhat promiscuously between philosophy and science, between science and ideology, between ideology and history. My own encounter with Althusser is guilty of going in the direction of politics, toward a political reading of his core concepts and a political interpretation of his philosophical positions. I see ideology as a concept that opens to the terrain of politics. The appellation cultural Marxism has always felt a bit off to me, at least as much as, quote, Western Marxism, a term that obscures the influence of Lenin and Mao, among others, when a substantial part of Althusser's project has to do, in my view, with questions of politics, with questions of the state and the elementary forms of political life. Althusser did not claim the concept of politics for himself, though honored those like Machiavelli and Lenin who did. I would propose that we gain much in reading Althusser from the relatively restrictive tradition of political theory. Okay, so into these sort of three big kind of points or ideas that I draw from Warren's book. First, the conjuncture, a term that has come back into vogue, but often as a synonym for something like context, when arguably conjuncture is precisely the critique of a historicist appeal to context. Right? Context is bounded in time and by a set of historical determinations. Conjuncture is a category of overdetermination of multiple levels of a social system and the unevenness of historical processes. Conjuncture, I might propose, is not an elapse of time at all, but a certain balance of forces that may hold or break at any moment. Ideas are weapons in that shifting balance of forces. The conjuncture is a political situation, not a historical moment, a certain situation that can endure for decades or even centuries, or with patriarchy in the family, a particular balance of forces that can determine the concept and experience of history itself. With this revised and anti-historicist concept of conjuncture in hand, I might ask, what is the conjuncture in which Althusser's thought operates? What are the core contradictions around which it is organized? Who are Althusser's contemporaries? Must we not treat feminism as part of that conjuncture and treat feminists as Althusser's contemporaries? Feminists like Silvia Federici, who quarreled with him about the history of political thought, or like Maria Maciocchi, who corresponded with him about Communist Party politics, or like Suzanne Blaise, whose writings on women and feminism are part of his personal library, or in fact, like Juliet Mitchell, who developed Althusser's ideas about contradiction and overdetermination, social reproduction, ideology, and the family for a psychoanalytic socialist feminism. Right? In her early essay on women's liberation, right, Women, the Longest Revolution, and in her monumental study, Psychoanalysis in the Family, Mitchell develops the Althusserian idea that a social formation is a complex unity of systems of practice, and that ideological practice is critical to the social, political, and economic structure of patriarchy. In Women's Oppression Today, Michelle Barrett further elaborates the Althusserian concept of ideology to advance a sociology of women's oppression. Professor Balibar already cited Donna Haraway's excellent essay on situated knowledges, even Catherine McKinnon's Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, which cites Althusser only in passing, could be claimed as the most fully elaborated work of, quote, theoretical anti-humanism in the feminist canon. The echoes of Althusser and McKinnon's early work are essential to understanding her feminist project and its complex relationship to Marxism. These texts are now feminist classics. Althusser's ideas are thus vital to the history of feminism. They are part of a broad theoretical inheritance so far-reaching and wide-ranging that we can identify competing currents within Althusserian feminism. So this has nothing to do with borrowing, quote, good ideas from bad men, as a certain model of feminist reading would have. It's about pushing ideas in directions that the author himself could not go, toward discoveries that he could not make, guided by the commitment to politics, philosophy, and science that the very name Althusser represents. But the encounter between Althusser and feminism runs both ways. Quote, "Everything has come to me through women," Althusser says in a rare television interview from 1980, given just months before he murdered Helene. Quote, "And this is the reason why I attribute a very important role, a predominant role, to the women's movement. Women do not know their capacity, the possibilities, their capability to do politics," end quote. In fact, there are scattered pieces of evidence that Althusser did reflect on the capacity, possibilities, and capability of women to do politics. His archives in France contain still unpublished and untranslated writings on the women's movement in Europe. His correspondence with the Marxist feminist and militant Maria Maciocchi revolves around, in part, the difficulties that European communist parties were having in dealing with the sexual politics of the family. He recognizes that the gendered and generational conflicts within the bourgeois family and conflicts between the family and other ISAs were at the heart of the revolt in May of 1968. In 1969, at the height of his influence on the European left, the Marxist feminist Silvia Federici, as I already mentioned, wrote an absolutely blistering review of Althusser's book on Montesquieu, which had been published several years before. Among other things, Federici pointed to Althusser's patriarchalism and noted the way that he projected this patriarchalism back onto his most cherished male authors. I found to this point no evidence of a reply to Federici's critique, but his personal library includes works by Suzanne Blaise, founder of the United Feminist Party in France, and other notable feminists, as well as his own commentaries on their work. In other words, the encounter between Althusser and feminism runs in both directions. Althusser's ideas are part of the feminist canon, but feminism also shaped and informed and challenged these ideas. Whether he was conscious of this or not is almost irrelevant by the light of his own stated positions. He saw that Marxism had been entirely too focused on debates about consciousness and had no real grasp on the unconscious as a major factor in social life. Feminism, I would suggest, remains a vital part of the Althusserian unconscious. We can trace the mutual encounter between Althusser and feminism all the way back to his writings from the 1950s, before he had officially joined the Communist Party. In an early essay on obscene conjugality in the Catholic youth movement, Althusser is sharply critical of the family values politics that had come into fashion in the post-war period. It was a time when trad-cath familialism was flourishing on the progressive left, as well as on the reactionary right. The young Althusser rejected this new familialism, which he understood to be a repackaged form of the old familialism, offering a pseudo-equality for women, premised on her subordination in and to the patriarchal family. Althusser's drift toward communist militancy, inspired personally by Helene, was prompted politically by these and other disagreements with the Catholic left. While it is justifiably claimed that Althusser never fully with the Catholicism of his youth, that this explains his fidelity to the Communist Party and even illuminates some of his key philosophical ideas, I think it's imperative that we recognize in Althusser's thought a perpetual war against the patriarchalism that was his intellectual inheritance. These last 2 points, I'll be much briefer. This brings me to the question of reading and what a feminist reading of Althusser entails, how it draws from his own lessons about reading and listens for the silences that enable his thought to function in the way that it does. For me, it's not a question or a choice between internalist and externalist methods, or a reading that would focus on the ideas themselves versus a reading that would begin from the external facts of Althusser's life and thought, including the fact that he was a celebrated and then vilified Marxist philosopher as well as an ordinary wife killer in a country where at least one wife is killed by her husband every week. As I see things, reading according to his own protocols, male dominance and male power are not external to Althusser's thought, but a red thread running through it. Sexist ideas about women, androcentric ideas about society, and patriarchal assumptions about the family are not elements of his biography separate from his philosophy. They're an undeniable part of Althusser's thought, just as Althusser's thought is an irrepressible part of the history of radical feminism. Following Montag's practice of reading Althusser to grasp not the meaning of the text, but the, quote, contradictions around which it was constituted, I would propose that we treat patriarchy as a primary contradiction around which Althusser's philosophy is constituted. An internalist position, if it's to genuinely grasp Althusser's concepts, must admit that patriarchy and male dominance is everywhere thematized in Althusser's work, and not only in the psychoanalytically inflected writings where we might expect to find them. Patriarchy is central to his readings in the history of political thought, especially Montesquieu and Rousseau. It's also part of what's at stake in his critique of Levi-Strauss and the claims of structuralist anthropology. Patriarchy is the point where he borrows and I think also breaks most decisively with Lacan. And the question of male dominance reverberates even in the silences in his theory. For example, in a concept of ideology that centers on the family, but never speaks of the social relations that ensure that, quote, the individual is always already a subject even before it is born, and make it certain, quote, that it will bear its father's name. Even if the ideas could be separated from the man, from the marriage, from the murder, and from the misogyny that absolves or excuses it, it doesn't mean they should be, nor does it mean we will understand those ideas any better. Finally, the question of apparatuses and the view of ideology as a state apparatus. I don't have much time to say everything I'd like to about Althusser's theory of state apparatuses, but let me again cite Wharton, who notes that, quote, in fact, the most important word in the phrase, the ideological state apparatuses functioned by ideology, was all but elided in the innumerable critiques and interpretations, namely the term apparatuses. A term that I think, if we can hear the echo of its closest English cognate appliances, forces us into the family, right? To observe the reorganization of domestic life in the 20th century, first by birth control and then by household commodities like vacuum cleaners, televisions, and kitchen appliances. Kristen Ross has written on this in connection with the emergence of a politics of everyday life and a new familialism in post-war France, shaped by American consumerism on the one hand and colonialism on the other. I would argue that the family is absolutely central to the concept of ideology, that the family is not simply one of the many ideological state apparatuses that Althusser sort of elaborates or identifies, but is in fact central to the concept of itself, to the theory of the state as a reproductive system, indeed to the way that ideology is meant to answer the question of reproduction, to the idea of apparatus as a political technology or machinery of the state, to the theory of the subject as bearing his father's name and thus being irreplaceable, even the view of fetal personhood that is embedded in the ordinary practice of ideology as Althusser elaborates it long before this idea became an aspect of obscure right-wing Catholic constitutionalism. Now, I think, of course, Althusser dodges the woman question in his notes on ideology, in part because he sees the family and the state from what Catherine McKinnon has described as the male point of view, the perspective of dominance, which expresses and reflects male supremacy. Politics is a relation between men in Althusser, as Eve Sedgwick might say, even is practiced in solitude. Althusser avoids the question and perspective of women, even and especially when commenting on the family, because he sees the family as a political society that forms men into political subjects. He's not terribly concerned with how the family forms or deforms women, or how women participate in the reproduction of social relations, including their own subjection. Althusser rejected the philosophy of origins, but nonetheless, his own thought revolves around patriarchy as the true origins of political life. Women are absent from his account because social and political life is not principally about them. It's about fathers and sons and fatherless sons, as if mothers and daughters, women in general, were largely irrelevant to social reproduction. Althusser could see the family as a political institution and as an apparatus of the state. He could put reproduction at the center of theoretical and practical struggles in Marxism. But he could not see that sex itself is a site and source of power in the family, nor could he admit that the family is a machinery for reproducing male supremacy on different levels of a social structure. He also did not seem to notice the way that this supremacy was secreted in everyday life, in the school and the church, but especially in that apparatus that supports them both and sustains the state as a whole. What he says of Montesquieu, that is Althusser, could be said of his own theory. Quote, "A man and his son are all that is needed." Althusser treats ideological state apparatuses as an artifact of this father-son relationship. What he fails to see is how this machinery imposes itself on women and girls as fate, subjects in the Althusserian sense, and denied even this dubious honor in the scene of ideology. In closing, I might say that there's another perpetual war, of course. Sometimes it's been called the battle of the sexes, which is fought within the family and over the boundary that divides and relates public and private life. It is only when Althusser appears alongside another group of his contemporaries, some of whom I've tried to name today, that his unknowing contributions to feminist struggle might be measured. Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. And the next speaker is Despina.
Hello all, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, I would like to share that I really feel happy, very happy and very honored to be here on the anniversary of our teacher's book. I personally feel that I owe a great deal to Warren Montag, first and foremost for his open-hearted support, understanding and guidance he provided to me as a young scholar, while his encouragement to keep writing and not to give up on theory at the very moment when we are trying to survive capitalism has been a constant, caring reminder for me all these years. Also a reminder that the radical theory is built in communities and not in individual pursuits. I read Warren Montag's writings as having the effect, among others, of a systematic intervention demystifying the Althusserian legacy. This is a real relief for those of us who got to know Althusser within the blur of a debate that disparaged him as outdated and unpopular at best, or as anti-Marxist at worst. Warren Montag's unapologetic yet critical and symptomatic reading of Althusser's texts shifts our view from a tendency to simply defend or reject, from a futile search for the philosopher's intention to the real effects of their philosophy, and to the openness of drawing lines of demarcation and of confronting our contemporary questions. In this light, and inspired by the work of Warren Montag, as well as from our discussions on theoretical possibilities today, I would like to share some thoughts with you, trying to posit, as Robyn did before, the feminist movement and its theoretical contributions of the last 50 years as a possible interlocutor of the Althusserian legacy. So, by problematizing several common, yet socially and theoretically invisible practices of everyday life, feminist struggles and feminist critique have not stopped dismantling certainties of social relations as well as of theory. The race, class, gender triptych has once and for all changed our perception of how social hierarchies are constructed, thus challenging the Marxist theoretical debates not only to stop regarding economy as the sole generator of social inequality, but also to transform its theoretical method per se in order to address such a new perspective. Amidst the proliferation of the feminist struggles, more and more generators of social hierarchy started gaining visibility. It is not only race, class, and gender, but a multiplicity of divisions such as nationality, ethnicity, religion, ability, or age that reproduce social inequality. Intersectionality approaches within the feminist critique argue that the oppressions generated by such divisions are not to be subjected under any sort of prioritization that would argue, for example, that class is a more important and fundamental factor than gender or ethnicity, because that would be a reductionist and evaluative practice, reproducing the same social hierarchies that are producing in turn such oppressions. Such a perspective, though, brings up some methodological questions, like, if oppressions are as many and diverse as the existing individuals, how can we in fact examine them? Are we able to make theoretical abstractions without lapsing into reductionism at all? And how can we examine concepts that are non-homologous epistemologically, concepts such as class, ethnicity, and disability? And from a perspective of political strategy now, how can the concept of class be approached after the contributions of Black intersectional feminism? And how can differentially oppressed individuals be unified? Now, within the theoretical debate of intersectionality, many contributions have rejected the so-called additive model that would address intersecting oppressions as a group of individual oppressions added one after the other. On the contrary, Patricia Hill Collins introduces the notion of the matrix of domination to suggest that intersecting oppressions are not only simultaneously effective, but mutually constructed. This results, following Ashley Borer, in race being always already a gendered, sexualized, and classed category. Under this light, every oppression seems to be shaping its meaning via every other oppression with which it inseparably coexists. No oppression can be found in its pure form. It is always already realized within the infinity of determinants that are active in every social condition. Such a perspective, rather than arguing that oppressions will be somehow magically dissolved if a supposed most fundamental oppression is dissolved, it suggests, on the contrary, that challenging an aspect of the matrix of domination results in the whole edifice being challenged. The absence of a pure form of contradiction, as well as the rejection of the primacy of the economy, is of course at the very center of the Althusserian critique. In Contradiction and Overdetermination, Althusser states, and I quote, The capital-labor contradiction is never simple, but always specified by the historically concrete forms and circumstances in which it is exercised. It is specified by the forms of the superstructure, the state, dominant ideology, religion, political organized movements, and so on. Specified by the internal and external historical situation, contradiction is always overdetermined. End of quote. Overdetermination, as highlighted in detail by Warren Montag in Althusser and his contemporaries, thus suggests that, in my mind, in different conjunctures, different determinants are likely to prevail due to the different forms of articulation of the contradictions, stemming out from the specific level of the development of class struggle. Hence, those determinants do not stand either as a root or as a primal cause, but as a snapshot, if I may, of the current balance of power. Under this perspective, capitalist exploitation can be seen as simultaneously determining and determined, manifested differently in every different locus of the complex social web, thus challenging the approaches simplistically talking about a dominant contradiction. Overdetermination, while it enables contingency, incompleteness, decentralization, and fragmentation, it simultaneously leaves space for theorizing tendencies, for detecting specific social practices as producing and reproducing patterns. Overall, overdetermination raises the question of how the infinity of singularities is articulated in every different conjuncture. Thus, reading our current situation through the lens of overdetermination actually brings us to the question of how capitalism operates in this specific conjuncture. What are the contradictions that play a catalytic role, thus determining inequality? And so, if this is the case, what about class? Now, following Poulaja's contributions on the notion of the class as a dynamic social relation entailing multiple social practices, we could argue that class can be interpreted vis-à-vis exactly its dynamic modality in the context of the specific overdetermination of the oppressions within a specific conjuncture. At the same time, in an attempt to reverse this point of view, we might also suggest that the notion of class could also be the lens through which intersecting oppressive divisions can be read. But in this case, how could we avoid reductionism? Could we, in the first place, and how? I'm thinking that the above-mentioned bidirectional approach of class as simultaneously determining and determined suggests that the intersecting social divisions function as activators or accelerators of the concept of class at every different conjuncture of social power balance. However, this does not mean that it understands class as an empty signifier, that it is filled with content per conjuncture. Indeed, a Marxist approach cannot but conceive of exploitation as the fundamental element of the notion of class. Under this prism of an overdetermined intersectionality that both illuminates class relations and is illuminated by them, our question could be formulated as follows then. What social form does exploitation take in every different conjuncture? This question attempts, in its turn, to read the concept of exploitation through the overall lens of the social practices within which exploitation takes place, while maintaining a particular concern to shed light specifically on the patterns that keep emerging in diverse social contexts, namely in the conditions that ensure the long-term reproduction of relations of exploitation, as Marxist feminist theory of social reproduction urges us to do. At this point, let us consider the following correspondence. Just as the reading of class through its overdetermination of the intersecting oppressions is an alternative theoretical path to simplistic approaches of the capital-labor contradiction. Correspondingly, the reading of the categories of race, gender, etc., under the light of class, defined dynamically as always already overdetermined, help us read these categories in a non-essentialist way. For wouldn't be essentialist to say that age, ability, gender, or ethnicity constitute divisions in themselves beyond and outside the material conditions that produce them. For what can gender mean if not the lived experiences of oppression, exclusion, and marginalization that it echoes? Does oppression, exclusion, and marginalization implied by gender division exist beyond and outside the conditions of exploitation within which they are articulated and reproduced? Of course, I'm not describing a schema here suggesting that just as the owners of the means of production exploit the non-owners of the means of production, so do they oppress them within the spectrum of intersecting divisions they also impose upon them. Such a schema cannot answer either why women not included in the exploited classes experience gender violence, let alone why women of the exploited classes experience gender violence from men of the exploited classes. To answer these new questions, we need to decode, I think, the non-economic material dynamics of gender divisions. The reproduction of capitalism is not only secured through economic relations, but it is also ensured by a series of non-economic material relations that reproduce relations of domination and subordination within and especially outside the very sites of production and extraction of surplus value. McCarthy and DeSantis suggest that, and I quote, the structural primacy of class does not necessarily entail its own political primacy. Indeed, when grasped at a conjectural and not simply abstract level, the dynamism of the class structure reinforces or activates non-class social structures and subjectivities, which in turn can become central to conjunctural processes of class formation, end of quote. Such an approach directly communicates with the rationale of overdetermination, I think, and in any case, it seems that addressing the need for it aims at addressing the need for a non-reductionist yet Marxist approach. However, as far as a radical political strategy is concerned, it is useful to distinguish whether and in what way the struggles against, for example, gender or ethnic oppression can be considered as class struggles in a broader political sense. If we use a concept of society as a whole complex and determined system, then we could think that every collective social action that would challenge the social mechanics of exploitation could fall, in the last instance, under the spectrum of class struggles. We are talking about a domino effect here. Let us refer to the example of the feminist struggles for the termination of femicides. Such struggles, by giving visibility to gender violence and the relations of power that generate it, simultaneously bring up and challenge the gender division of labor within households based on the ideology that attributes the public civic space to white males and the private sphere to women. This in turn potentially challenges in specific environments also religion identities that deepen such divisions and so forth. Of course, while divisions on the basis of race or gender existed before capitalism, a Marxist perspective needs to be able to interpret how these divisions are now functioning in relation to the reproduction of relations of exploitation, how they are reconceptualized, and what particular forms they acquire. In other words, we need to interpret how divisions of a non-economic nature are performed within capitalism. But such a query could also be articulated reversely, in the search of the relation of the struggles for racial and gender equality to class struggle. The contributions of Black a Black feminism, for example, highlight how race plays a crucial role in class stratification. Barbara Jean Fields explains that historically, race has justified why some were rightly deprived of what others rightly possessed. And this helps us understand how the deprivation of these rights, as depicted, for instance, in the seizure of political power from the non-Black individuals, automatically implied a certain class stratification and exploitation. Stuart Hall is also explicit from his perspective when he states that race being, I quote, the mechanism by which this stratification of the class is accomplished, enters into the way Black labor, male and female, is distributed as economic agents at the level of economic practices and the class struggles which result from it, and into the way the fractions of the Black laboring classes are reconstituted through the means of political representation. The constitution of this fraction as a class and the class relations which ascribe it function as race relations. Race is thus also the modality in which class is lived, the medium through which class relations are experienced, the form in which it is appropriated and fought through. End of quote. Now, coming to the end of my presentation and returning to overdetermination, I would like to suggest that approaching the concept of overdetermination as the very moment of the intervention of politics in theory, the moment when the socio-historical specificity is addressed within the context of and simultaneously as descendering of social reproduction. Under this light, and in order to answer the former post-question of collectivizing resistances, we may also recall the proposal of Angela Davis to rethink intersectionality from the standpoint of the struggles, not only from the point of theorizing bodies and experiences. But let us insist a bit on that. Let us think of struggles as something more than a tactical coalition of the oppressed who set their differences aside in order to confront the state machine. This coalition arises not because we put our differences aside, but precisely because we bring them to the center. What motivates us is not some individualized biographical experience. Representing our experiences as experiences of oppression marks, in my mind, an attempt to cognitively access this oppression. And while this attempt does not consist a first step of a theoretical abstraction, yet it consists of a shift in the representation of our relation to the existing conditions of our existence. Hence, a shift of a consequent misrecognition. In other words, the questioning of subjection that struggles suggest also constitutes a shift in the imaginary of the masses, the material bodily imaginary as interpreted by Warren Montag. This shift has a de-individualizing, a collectivizing effect, contrary to the tendency of individualization and homogenization that contemporary power performs. In this respect, mass struggles can be seen both as a site of collective attempts at new forms of subjectification, and consequently as a site of descendered representations and misrecognitions. This decentralization, being against and outside the system of existing representations, to use Warren Montag words, opens up the possibility of the emergence of new knowledge and theory, in my mind. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, Despina. Yes, Joseph, please go on.
Okay, I was just gonna say we'll take a 15-minute break and then we'll come back right after 15 minutes.